Week 5, and though in terms of time period we are relatively short, there's a lot to unpack here. Hopefully, we've understood the discussions of previous periods and are prepared to understand the revolution of the contemporary world. So let's jump in. This lecture is actually going to be a pretty long one compared to the previous ones, so we've got 2 pages of terms to go over. So here's page 1. Fascism. A fascist government is, by definition, an ultra-right-wing, ultra-conservative government that is defined by extreme hostility towards socialism, Bolshevism, or communism, and deeply suspicious of, and often attempting to undermine, democratic institutions. Historically, fascist governments have been preferential to businesses, particularly large businesses, and craft policies that favor them. They also tend to be socially repressive and enforce conformity over individual freedoms. Authoritarianism regimes enforce strict adherence to law and a very conservative set of social norms. Protest, disruptions, dissident activity is often harshly squashed. The authoritarian style of governments is not a government in and of itself, but rather an approach to governing that is expressed in fascistic as well as communist regimes, and to one degree or another in ostensibly democratic governments. A good example of this would be the reaction to the civil rights movement in the United States and South Africa, or the agitation for women's rights to vote in the UK and France. Socialism is ill-defined by its very nature and can often be conflated with other forms of socioeconomic policies such as communism. Why? Well, because it's a broad spectrum of approaches that emphasizes the rights of citizens, particularly emphasizing those who work. It can take the form of unemployment insurance, old age pension schemes, medical care for citizens, and varying degrees of oversights of industries. Communism, most famously though not exclusively, was articulated by Karl Marx in the 19th century. Communism's hallmark is the holding of property and the means of production, as well as the benefits of those productions, by the society writ large. In theory, everyone is paid enough to live comfortably without harming others. In reality, those ideals never really emerge. Often conflated with socialism, indeed even Marx said socialism was a pathway to communism, the two are different. In communism, for example, there would be little or no private ownership, whether of business, housing, vehicles, whatever, while in socialism, there's no restrictions against private ownership. For example, Sweden, people still own their cars, they still own their houses, and they still own their businesses despite being unabashedly socialist. Page 2. Globalization is kind of a long simmering thought throughout our course. It's a nice thread that's kind of wove its way through our lectures. And so far, it's really not been that prominent, but it comes to a head in the 20th century as the speed of transportation makes interconnectedness of economies not only possible, but profitable. Globalization would be impossible were it not also for the fluid movement of capital, also known as money, and the presence of multinational companies. Whether you are aware of it or not, globalization has a profound impact on the late 20th century and early 21st century. Capitalism is, at least in theory, an economic approach that emphasizes exclusively private ownership of capital, that is, money, goods, services, and property. There would, in a truly idealistic capitalist world, be little to no government interference upon economic systems, and again, in theory, the distribution of goods, ideas, and capital would be self-regulating through a completely free and open market. Caveat emptor, though. Anti-colonialism is a political movement in a colonized or dependent nation to remove direct foreign governance or heavy foreign influence upon the home country. This emerges in the wake of World War I and accelerates in the aftermath of World War II, with the movements ranging from peaceful non-compliance and essentially shutting down foreign governments to anti-colonial wars peppered with extreme violence. Finally, post-industrialism. This is the transition that happens under globalist free market economies, wherein formerly powerful manufacturing countries or economic associations transition from manufacture to more service and information oriented industries such as banking or trade. Without globalization, it is difficult to see how post industrialization could really happen, or at least not on the scale that we see it today. All right, with that out of the way, let's check in on our world in the early 20th century. One of the dominant ideas of the mid to late 19th century was this concept of a balance of powers. Put simply, each major power in Europe was strong enough to take on one another, and thus war became extremely stupid and senselessly destructive. I mean, how dumb would you have to be to engage in a war where you would devastate your own infrastructure and economy? So, thus, the balance of power maintained a fragile peace for about 100 years since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. This check upon aggression, however, didn't mean that countries, particularly but not exclusively European countries, wouldn't seek advantage against each other. We've already seen that with the scramble for Africa, set in place a framework for competition that would avoid war in Europe. We also saw it in the European and powers as well as Japan divvying up China in Southeast Asia. That is not, however, enough, and the fear of another nation being ascendant in Europe, as well as the appearance of new and stronger European nations, such as Germany and Italy in the mid 19th century, leads to this formation of alliances through secret and not so secret pacts. It's not enough to be strong alone, you have to have strong friends with you. To make a long story short, by the time we get to 1914, there are two major alliances. For our purposes, we'll shorthand them and call them the Central Powers, which are Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, as well as Italy. Countering this central power is the Alliance, which composed of Great Britain, France, Russia, and Italy. Did I mention Italy twice? Yes. Yes, I did. Did I say that these alliances were a means of increasing a country's standing in Europe, right? Well, of course I did. So Italy essentially joined both alliance schemes. They did this thinking that they would get into a war and have to fight with themselves. Well, no, not really. They saw it as hedging their bets. Now, did these two alliances think that these wars would inevitably lead to the longest and most devastating war that Europe had seen to date? Well, yes, actually, some of them did see these alliances as happening. Otto von Bismarck saw it coming, didn't he? World War I was sparked ostensibly by the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand while he was visiting Sarajevo. The young man, a 19-year-old radical, who shot him is often blamed for sparking World War I. But is his the blame alone? Or is he merely an excuse, a kind of trigger man for a precipitating event that European powers were more or less spoiling for? I tend to believe that the assassination was a convenient, if tragic, excuse for belligerent powers to bypass, or maybe at least test, this balance of powers. Why? Well, colonialism wasn't limited to Asia or Africa, but it had been happening in Europe, particularly in southeastern Europe, for quite a while. As the Ottoman Empire lost ground and territory in Europe, small revolutionary states emerged as nominally autonomous actors in Europe. These smaller guys were squabbled over because they had resources that the bigger players wanted. Resources meant a stronger industrial base. A stronger industrial base is often equated with a stronger military. And what happens when you stockpile ammunition, weapons, and soldiers? Well, there's this old axiom. When all you have is a hammer, every problem suddenly looks like a nail. So what are the motivations? Well, there are a lot of players and there's a complex web of reasons for what they do. Some of it, surprisingly, comes down to grammar and the cold indifference of communication at the time. Russia, for its part, had been making headway in the Balkans using the rhetoric of pan-Slavic ties, that Russia was the motherland of the Slavic people, and there were some people living in the Balkans who were Slavic, so hey, become part of us. This was in part a genuine impulse, but mostly it was to counter two historic rivals, the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarians. Access to oil and metal resources in the Balkans didn't hurt either. Austria-Hungary was already a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual empire, and adding smaller states such as Serbia were just natural extensions of their fragmented empire. Access to those resources certainly didn't sour the deal, plus countering the Russians and the Ottomans was always a good motivator. If we move further afield, the Germans, who were in a nominal alliance with the Austro-Hungarians, had been sending kind of mixed signals to the Austro-Hungarians, saying, on the one hand, hey, we got your back, we're in an alliance, we're in it together, we're stronger together, all this wonderful rhetoric. But on the other hand, they did kind of send communiques saying, try diplomatic means to resolve this conflict, and that should be enough to guide your way out of this. So when negotiations broke down, well, I say negotiations, ultimatums, broke down, look what happened. Germany was in essence more concerned with countering the industrial rivalry of Great Britain and the territorial rivalry of France than they were about the Balkans. France, for itself, had kind of a tepid alliance with both Russia and Great Britain, mostly to counter the Austro-Hungarians and Germans, respectively. I'm not certain they saw war looming the same way that the Germans did, but at the very least they were cavalier about entering into the conflagration. Without putting too fine a point on it, the Great War was a disaster. Though it started out with similar rhetoric on both the Central Powers and the Allied Powers side, things like fighting for freedom, defending the homeland, for the king, all that nonsensical baloney that people use to dupe people into getting into war, the war turned out to be far, far, far more devastating than either side had ever dreamed of. All while Europe and to a lesser degree Asia and Africa were burning and being devastated, the United States remained a reluctant witness to the destruction. Progressivists were leery of entering into a war that was, in their eyes, immoral, and isolationists also warned that American youth would be killed in Europe's folly. So why did the United States enter? One could argue convincingly that money was a deciding factor. Though the US had lent money to fuel the war on both sides, there was far more money lent to Great Britain than to Germany, for example, just picking two. All sides were basically falling apart, though, in this war. Russia had undergone two revolutions and withdrawn from the war. Austria-Hungary and France had mass mutinies in their armies, with tens of thousands refusing to return to the front lines. The Ottomans were fighting a losing war, and eventually, by the end of the war, would kind of collapse to be replaced by a secular Turkish state. And Great Britain had depleted its treasury in the first year or so of the war and had taken out a lot of loans from the United States, especially United States banks. So if Britain pulled out, or worse, lost the war, those loans might not be paid back. And so, with a veneer of fighting for progressive ideals of things like self-determination and freedom and the power of open trade, the United States participated in about 17 or so months of the Great War and tipped the balance towards Germany's loss. The aftermath was one that no writer or politician could have expected before the war. Tens of thousands of young men came home physically and emotionally mangled by mechanized warfare, resulting in what we will call, for shorthand, the lost generation. These people did not fit in. This mass PTSD that the society was ill-equipped to deal with left them feeling isolated and alone. It also signaled the end of progressivism, especially in the United States. Despite its critical role in changing the course of the war, the United States' advice about the post-war settlement was ignored. At home, Woodrow Wilson, who had secretly suffered a stroke, was resoundingly defeated due to his perceived weakness in negotiation, and America turned inward. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had already dissolved, as had the Ottomans, so only Germany faced the brunt of the Treaty of Versailles that placed the blame for the war squarely upon Germany. France and Great Britain put onerous, burdensome penalties on Germany. One German general quipped that France and Great Britain had not negotiated peace, merely a 20-year pause in the war. I want to know what's with the prescient Germans. By 1938, Europe was again plunged into war, in what we would call the Second World War. The Second War would be far more devastating and inhuman than the first for a variety of reasons. Given that the previous war was fought within living memory, hadn't anyone learned their lesson? Well, I think the answer is that they learned the wrong lessons from World War I. In Europe, the scars of war were largely unhealed. The onerous Treaty of Versailles had hobbled Germany's post-war recovery and made it a hotbed of resentment and anger. Italy's political instability and lackluster reward, for lack of a better term, for participating in World War I on the winning side, yes, they sided with the Alliance, led to visceral anger. Spain, who really played no part in World War I, nonetheless gravitated more and more towards fascism and ended its relatively liberal monarchy, while Great Britain and France were more concerned with overseas colonies and putting down those anti-colonial movements. These big colony powers of France and Great Britain pillaged and exploited colonies to rebuild their home economies, and at the same time had to deal with increasingly violent anti-colonial movements. Overall, Europe was fertile ground for radicals who preached the overthrow of the existing order. The Soviet Union, itself having just fought a civil war that was funded by foreigners, felt it incumbent upon itself to incite revolution, particularly Bolshevik revolution, elsewhere. Turnabout is fair play, after all. That fear of communism, which was sometimes overblown and often tied to anti-foreign or anti-Jewish rhetoric, led many European societies to gravitate towards authoritarian policies, and in many cases towards outright fascistic governments. Meanwhile, across the oceans, both America and Japan turned relatively inward. America's America First nativism looked at all outsiders suspiciously. Some of these America First adherents were openly pro-fascist, particularly pro-Nazi. A lot of people don't know that in the lead up to World War I in 1934, there was 60,000 American Nazis who held a rally at Madison Square Garden. Japan itself, having experimented with a kind of liberal open democracy in the 1920s, was increasingly co-opted by a militaristic, authoritarian element within its government. The scars of war in the United States were largely swept under the rug, and it led to this thinking of never again would the United States participate in a foreign war that was not of their own making. This lasts until the market crash of 1929, which brought about radical changes in America, Europe, and Asia. The United States, led by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, co-opted much of the rhetoric and ideas of socialism and, to a lesser degree, Bolshevik revolutionaries who argued convincingly that capitalism had failed America. On the flip side, in Japan, the Japanese militarists scrambled for more resources as the crash caused many of the countries to raise tariffs and prevent exports. So the militaristic faction became more and more powerful, and they kind of became semi-fascistic, pseudo-fascistic. Well, anyway, surprisingly, perhaps because of that inward-looking nature of American politics, fascism began to lose out to those more socialist impulses. Many of these impulses were predicated upon evangelical Christian ideals as enumerated in the Bible. Stories of early Christians sharing amongst themselves and prospering, and even the miracle of the fishes and loaves, played a great role in American enthusiasm for socialist policies under FDR, such as unemployment insurance, minimum wages, child labor laws, and, of course, Social Security. What, though, made fascism so popular elsewhere? Most of those who became fascistic leaders were raised up by populism, harnessing the general anger and pointing it towards simplistic answers, such as removing foreigners, reducing crime rates, and ensuring everyone had a job. Were these crises really that easily solved? Well, no, not really. Primarily, many of the crises that fascistic regimes focused upon were manufactured or artificial crises. For example, to explain the lack of good paying jobs in Germany, instead of blaming manufacturers who kept lowering the wages and removing the protections of unemployment, Jews and radical left political activists were demonized, with proxies claiming that there was a vast conspiracy against the quote good, hardworking German people unquote. Essentially, they were saying your money's being siphoned, your money goes to support layabouts, your job went to an ethnic who wasn't born in Germany, and similar arguments. Fascistic regimes needed these crises in order to crack down on initially minorities, but that was just an excuse to eliminate certain democratic and liberalist practices. Things like voting rights, being able to face your accuser at trial, and detention without charges. Those were all kind of very slowly eroded away and sometimes not so slowly. And so centers eventually became concentration camps. And unions were broken up as hotbeds of Bolshevik and thus anti-German activity, usually violently. What resulted were anti-liberal, anti-democratic authoritarian regimes who had very close ties with corporations. Corporations, for their part, enjoyed it. Their profits soared. And though there were many social programs put in place, for instance, there was a national lunch program for workers in Germany as well as in Italy. People were indeed working again, so that's good, but their right to safe working environments, their right to assemble, the right to air grievances, their right to vote had disappeared. Germany led the way in gearing up for war. Hitler himself was a World War I vet and had written extensively about how the country, and himself in particular, had been betrayed by the Treaty of Versailles and the German leadership who had listened to the poisonous lies of Jews, socialists, I don't know, spirits from the other realm. I mean, he goes off on tangents. Italy and Japan also followed suit, as did Spain, though Spain, as I mentioned before, does claim neutrality in the coming conflict. Moreover, the lead up to the war, it seems that both Germany and Japan were kind of psyching themselves up. There were emerging new propaganda pivots. If we look backward to World War I, we see that every single country who fought was talking about a brighter future, extolling the progress of their society and how they were the bastions of the future. In the lead up to World War II, there was the opposite impulse, a harkening back to a mythological past in order to make the empire great again. For Italy, the Roman Empire was the height of greatness, and Romanesque iconography was co-opted for state propaganda. Japan looked at the Meiji Restoration era as well as pre-Meiji Shogun period to evoke the past glory that was stolen from Japan. For Germany, this was the third time that the empire had been based in Germany. The first empire, or Reich, was the Holy Roman Empire. The second that was shattered by the betrayal of World War II, and the third was led by Hitler, who would make Germany great again by leading a 1,000-year empire, or Reich. Reaction to these buildups in non-fascistic countries were mixed. In the US, the UK, France, and Russia, many elements combined at different levels to a kind of lukewarm response to these rising threats. Some, such as Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, responded to the deep distaste for war expressed by the British people. So it wasn't so much that he appeased Hitler as he was appeasing his voting base. FDR faced a reluctant Congress himself, responding to American disinterest for a war, and could not prepare adequately for the pending conflict that experts warned was looming. It would take an overt act of aggression on a scale that had never been experienced by the US to goad anti-interventionists into action and to silence the pro-fascists in America. Stalin made a kind of deal with the devil or Faustian bargain because he knew a war would destabilize the Soviet Union. Stalin initially made a deal with Germany to split Poland and refused to believe that Germany would ever invade until it was too late. French President Albert Lebrun ordered the garrisons to the French-German border, but by the time he acted, it was too late as well, as the Germans bypassed French defenses and toppled the French government, installing a puppet government. World War II was a truly global war, with battles fought on all but 2 continents. The result was a completely devastated Europe and Asia, and the rise of 2 new superpowers who dwarfed global powers that had come before them. The United States, who was relatively unscathed by World War II, and Russia, or the Soviet Union, which had levered its huge population and wealth of resources that had been loaned to it by the Allies to capture and transport much of Germany's technological and manufacturing capability. A new world emerged with a new threat, the threat of complete annihilation of the human race, indeed all living creatures on the planet, as World War II ended with the advent of the atomic bomb. Later, these would become nuclear weapons. The old order of Europe, Asia, and Africa had been thrown into near complete chaos by the destruction visited upon them. This led to a threat of global instability as impoverished survivors of the war struggled just to continue living. As before, the Soviet Union saw a weak Europe and Asia as kind of an opportunity to export the revolution and increase its influence, if not its direct territory. Countering this move was the United States' emphasis upon globalization. See, at the end of World War II, the United States was producing about 50% of the finished goods for sale in the world. By entering into a rebuilding scheme that cost money up front, the benefit was an economy that became an international juggernaut. For example, before World War II, gold was used as the yardstick by which money was measured. By the 1960s, the US dollar was the go-to measurement for other currencies' value. In other words, the United States made transnational shipping on a global scale not only possible, but profitable. Now, the 2 superpowers were not just rivals on the economic stage, with sharply divergent visions of the future for the world, but they were also military rivals as well. This leads us to the so-called Cold War of 1945 to 1992. Perhaps I should say the First Cold War. As I just mentioned, the struggle of these superpowers was not just economic. At the rhetorical heart of the argument was this idea of capitalism against communism. But in reality, neither the United States nor the Soviet Union were pure in their rhetorical ideals. For example, Social Security programs expanded in the United States during the Cold War. Medicare and Medicaid are 2 prominent examples of the so-called capitalist American economy that provided low-cost or even free healthcare to the elderly and the poor. Both superpowers also made this great noise about how they were champions of social justice and stability. The Soviet Union touted its social harmony in a multi-ethnic society while critiquing Jim Crow segregation in the United States. But Stalin, who remained in power into the 1950s, killed tens of millions of ethnic minorities through forced labor and execution squads. Foreign policy was also a case of do as I say, not as I do for both powers in the same vein. The Cold War would not be very war-ish if there was not any conflict, but at the same time it wouldn't be very cold if things heated up between the Soviet Union and the United States. Therefore, most conflicts between the 2 superpowers were fought by proxies or intermediaries. For example, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was countered by American-funded and American-trained religious zealots who would later kind of go on to become Al-Qaeda. North Korea fought a coalition led by the United States while similarly being funded by the Soviet Union and provided manpower by communist China. The only real time that the 2 superpowers nearly came to actual direct blows was also the time that the human race almost made itself extinct, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Though not a term I covered, at the heart of the conflict was this idea of brinkmanship, the towing closer and closer and closer to the open warfare line, but not actually crossing it. The United States and Soviet Union were mere literal minutes away from what historians believe would have been an all-out nuclear exchange. Fortunately for all of us living today, cooler heads prevailed and both powers backed down. Part of the proxy war that I mentioned before was the anti-colonial movement. Not all anti-colonial movements were divided along the Soviet-influenced or American-influenced line, but they nonetheless diminished the role and power of traditional European colonial powers while creating a new political reality as well as new political concerns. Anti-colonial movements in India, though mostly nonviolent in its resistance to British rule, didn't end peacefully. Religious divides between Muslims and Hindus led to the division of India into three parts, Muslim Pakistan and Bangladesh, and mostly Hindu India. France faced anti-colonial movements in Vietnam, Algeria, and elsewhere, as well in Africa. Other Europeans, such as Portugal and Belgium, likewise found themselves unwelcome in colonies that they once held. It's easy to think that at its height, the Cold War was divided into two spheres, or maybe three spheres. The first world of the United States, most of Europe, and parts of Asia. The second world of the Soviet Union and its allies, and the third world that was mainly Africa and Asia and undeveloped. Despite the fact that phrases like third world country or first world problem still persist today, it's actually far more nuanced than that. For example, at one point, France left an alliance with the United States in order to more directly deal with the Soviet Union and other so-called non-aligned states in Africa and Asia. Similarly, Czechoslovakia detached itself from the Soviet Union in order to cultivate a better and more independent relationship with the rest of the world. We've largely focused on the political divisions of the world, but the reality is that most of the world was becoming more interconnected and industrialized. This leads us to post-industrialization. That is, the transition of a country's economic base from manufacturing towards more service economy, and the transition leaves a lot of uncertainty that we still see today. Beginning in the 1970s, as manufacturing begins to be offshored in developed countries like the UK, France, and the United States, many citizens begin to question what role their government should or could play in easing this transition. How far can governments reach? How about international rules? Is there a standard set, or is it a wild, lawless world where the powerful exploit the weak? All in all, it leads many to question if globalization is not just a race to the bottom. I'll dive into this to an example of this argument when I cover labor costs in just a minute. But before that, economic uncertainty can lead to a repetition of history. As people become economically and socially less mobile, this leads to a feeling of powerlessness. The rules and questions of global industrial production, manufacture, taxation, trade, and compliance are so complex that most people, including yours truly, feel overwhelmed by them. No wonder then that populism, even faux populism, is again on the rise. This can, and in some cases does, lead to manufactured crises. For example, think of terrorism and its impact on America. How likely is it that you will die by a terrorist's hand? 1 in 3? 1 in 10? 1 in 100? How about less than 1 in 1,000? Or basically a statistical anomaly so small that it would be tossed out of the results. What then is the danger posed by illegal immigration? How about mass shootings? Better yet, what about heart disease? Roughly 1 in 3 Americans die of heart-related disease, but is that how this is reported? Well, not according to this report. It seems like we've switched places. Now, it's enticing to look for easy answers to complex or sometimes random problems. It's hardwired into our minds. We sought patterns to escape predators and find prey when we were hunter-gatherers. That's hundreds of thousands of years of evolution that we're fighting against. But it can backfire. We see threats where there are minimal or non-existent, and we ignore the real threats because they're just not exciting, or they're hard to address, or because they take commitment. 70% of Americans believe climate change is real and a danger to our country, yet fewer than 1 in 3 would trade their gas-powered car for an electric car, even if they cost the same. On the last slide, I promised to explain the race to the bottom critique of globalization, especially as it comes to labor costs. In the United States, for example, certain safety and training equipment and requirements, as well as the cost of living, make manufacturing of any good, let's say washing machines, increasingly expensive. Labor costs are one of the most flexible costs for companies to control. Lower the cost of labor, and you increase the profit of a product sold. This played out throughout the 20th century. When it was still recovering from World War II, Japan became the home of cheap manufacture. By the 1970s, Japan had become quite good at it, and their workers' wages and the cost of living were ramping up. Manufacturers then shifted to Taiwan. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, Taiwan kind of became the go-to place for cheap products, and international companies moved all or some of their manufacture there. Then in the 1980s, China began to gain ground as a vast reservoir of cheap labor eager for jobs, so international companies shifted again. Now, on the cusp of 2020, China is posed to wean itself from disposable workforce into a more professional one. So where will manufacture go? I don't know. Possibly someplace inexpensive again. And a global market system, industrial or post-industrial nations cannot hope to offer cheap enough labor. Unfortunately, this is not an economics course, so I really can't answer the question of how that would be tackled, but it is an historical trend that we need to be aware of. Why? Because, like it or not, the globalized marketplace is asking liberal democracies all over the world to tackle these questions. And it's up to the citizens of these United States, you and I, to try to understand some of the issues involved and ask big questions. For example, as the stock market soars and company profits increase and CEO pay explodes, many question if a profit-driven model of business is really best. Can a business be successful if it doesn't increase its profits quarter after quarter after quarter after quarter? Or is more modest, steady gains sometimes more desirable? What about wealth and income? As it becomes pooled increasingly in fewer and fewer hands, what happens to those who are left behind? How do we tackle these social issues? What about health and safety, the environment? Finally, is disruption or radical revolution inevitable? Does that automatically mean the world around us will disintegrate? Or can we remake it into a better and more just world as the revolutionaries before us attempted to do? That's it for this week. Don't forget, we do have your historical analysis paper that needs to be turned in, as well as the final. You guys have been great. I will see you again maybe another time.